Is consultant cluster checking effective? An evaluation of consultant cluster checking in East Africa. Since 2009, I have participated in 6 different consultant cluster checking sessions with 3 language groups at a time in East Africa. Initially, some of the cluster checking sessions in East Africa included up to 10 language groups, but these days 3 groups is the maximum in one session. I have always ultimately enjoyed these cluster checking sessions, though they have not always been easy. In this paper, I would like to share with you my observations about a cluster checking session that occurred in October 2022. In Section 2, I will discuss the negative aspects of cluster checking. In Section 3, I will discuss some of the positive aspects of this type of checking. In Section 4, I will examine the kinds of consultant notes that were made about 2 of the language projects in the 2022 session, and look at the impact of those notes on their translations of Exodus, the book that we were evaluating. In Section 5, I will discuss some of the features of Paratext that have helped improve the quality of cluster checking. I will conclude with a brief summary in Section 6. In this oral presentation, I will be skipping some sections due to time limitations. There are at least 3 aspects of cluster checking that I view as negative. My main concern is with the fact that the checking is primarily exegetical checking. Secondly, it is hard for a consultant to keep all teams engaged in the session, especially when one team needs more help on issues than the other teams. Finally, while increased quantity is a good thing, I am sometimes concerned that the quality of the translation suffers in the push to reach the goals that the teams set for themselves. Cluster checking in East Africa is supposed to be just exegetical checking, in contrast to the comprehension checking that is done in Papua New Guinea. Despite the fact that comprehension checking in the normal PNG style is not a part of the consultant checking process, there are often interesting discoveries made when comprehension style of questions are asked. One of my favorites was at an earlier 2019 checking session in East Africa. In that session, I was listening to a team giving an English back translation of their translation of 1 Samuel 11:5. In this verse, Saul was coming in from the fields, and his cows were going in front of him, and then there was a clause with quoted speech. When I was listening to the oral back translation of the verse, my ears pricked up, but I thought, no, it is probably just because the translator's English is not very good. But, being the detail-oriented consultant that I am, I asked, who spoke? And the translator said, the cow spoke. We know that a donkey spoke in the Bible, so a talking cow is no big thing. But in their draft of the verse, it was just a grammatical glitch that accidentally resulted in the quotation being said by the cow. It took a few minutes for the team to rework the verse, but soon the cows were once again just plodding along in front of Saul, and Saul was the one asking, "Why is everyone crying?" We all had a good laugh, something that is always good, and then we were back to work again. In the Exodus session, instead of the normal comprehension checking that I would use in Papua New Guinea, I often had the translators draw pictures. In the tabernacle accounts of Exodus, these drawings were invaluable. The oral back translation would sound correct because it was literal, but the reality was that when they attempted to draw the item described in the verse, we discovered that the translation was wrong. When the advisors saw the pictures, none of them argued that the translation was correct. This might have been embarrassing except for the fact that most of the translations needed some small changes in order to communicate accurately. Because of the difficulty of keeping all teams engaged, some consultants have shifted to more of a spot-checking methodology in order to make cluster checking sessions move more quickly. By doing this, they keep the teams focused on known problems instead of listening to every verse. This type of spot checking is done when the interlinear looks good and the advisor or team have answered any questions that the consultant has sent in the consultant notes project. I seriously considered doing that when I got to Exodus 6, verses 4 through 25, which is basically a list of names with a few other details added. I wanted to skip it, and almost did, but I could not do it. So I asked the team that is generally the most literal and accurate to do the back translation. After trying to move through a few verses, we realized that it was not going to work. So I just stopped the session, asked the advisors to work with their teams correcting the passage at the end of the day, and said that I would listen to it the next day. One of the comprehension-like checking questions that I asked the main translator about the passage was, what happened after Levi was or lived for 137 years? If you read it like this, would someone in the village know what it meant? I was starting to move onwards when the usually very literal translator said, Dr. Martha, can we add, and he died? I told him yes, because I knew that it was necessary in the project that I worked on in Papua New Guinea, but I was surprised when I actually saw that change in his translation. Below is a screenshot of the Compare Versions tool of some of the verses that I almost skipped in the session. It shows the number of changes made even after answering notes in the Consultant Notes project. Checking each verse in a book does take longer, but sometimes the simplest passage has a problem, and if we consultants do not ask the right questions, their translations will not be accurate. In translation circles, there have been numerous discussions about quantity or speed versus quality. While cluster projects do tend to produce a larger quantity of translated material, the quality is basically dependent on the nature of the team, that is, the national translators and their translation advisor or exegete. In my initial preparation work for the 2022 session, I had put over 500 notes on the Language 3 project, over 700 on the Language 1 project, and over 1,200 on the Language 2 project. After 2 weeks of checking, the Language 3 project was down to 111 unresolved notes, the Language 1 project had 193 unresolved notes, and the Language 2 project had 1,094 unresolved notes. I had resolved a lot of their notes, but I had added an almost equal number of notes to the Language 2 project. I had worked with this same cluster project in 2015 when they were checking Matthew. Their New Testaments have been published, and now they are moving through the Old Testament. For the purpose of not having to redo the basics, I pulled up the 2015 checking report form and modified it to write up my 2022 checking report on Exodus. I was not surprised to see that their usage of Paratext tools had generally improved, but I was surprised to see that my evaluation of the style and quality of the translations had not changed greatly over the 7 years. The most literal team that was an accurate or detail-oriented team, Language 3, was still the same, but they were showing signs of being more willing to listen to non-literal translation suggestions. The most meaning-based translation, Language 1, was still in that category, and the team was slowly improving accuracy and formatting issues, but there was still room for improvement. The least adequate translation, Language 2, was still the least adequate and was at the point where I wondered whether keeping them in the group was the correct choice, because they were continuing to produce large quantities of material that were not of a high enough quality. This is what I see as the negative impact of cluster checking. While considering the negative impact of the pressure of keeping up with the other projects, I had to also consider the positive aspects of cluster checking. There are at least 3 aspects of cluster checking that are positive. The teams do tend to stay on schedule, which makes it easier to schedule consultant checking sessions in advance. The cost of bringing in 1 consultant instead of 3 are definitely lower. The most important positive aspect of cluster checking is that when the dynamics are correct, teams will learn from each other, and all of the translations will improve. I will skip the next two subsections of the paper due to time and share some examples of what happens when the dynamics are right in a cluster checking session. In Exodus 16:36, the translation in language 3 looked good, but when I asked them to explain it to me, I realized that the 1/10 concept was not communicating. So I asked the language 2 team to give a back translation of their translation since it was different. 10 measuring tins is the same as 1 ephah. The meaning-based translation group had followed a different model translation, and so we did not really look at their translation. But the language 3 team liked what the language 2 team had done and followed that model, though it looked a bit different because they were focusing on the equivalent volume and said 20 liters is the same as 1 ephah. In Exodus 32:4, the language 2 team gave a back translation that said, "These are your gods." One of the other teams immediately started asking them, "Why did you say gods instead of God?" There was only one statue of a calf, and the model translations that they had followed had God, and so they challenged the team that had the plural there. I said that the language 2 team's translation was fine, and told them about my experience in seminary when the professor and other students were laughing about the confused Hebrew text because they thought that there could only be one God since there was only one statue. Then I said, when I asked my friends in Papua New Guinea if there were any items or objects or places that were inhabited by more than one evil spirit, they immediately said that everyone knew that multiple spirits could coexist in one place. So I asked the African translators, and each group affirmed that in their worldviews, multiple spirits in one item was not a problem. So I encouraged them to change their translations to gods, which follows the Hebrew text. Just because Western commentary writers do not know about this phenomenon does not mean that we have to follow the Western perspective in translations for non-Western cultures. In Exodus 13:19, I asked all of the groups a question about why they were taking the bones of Joseph with them on the journey. I did not hear any clear answers, and it was the end of a day. I told them about Papua New Guinea and about the fact that bones were used for magical purposes. Because of that, the government in Papua New Guinea has laws about where expatriates can be buried because they do not want bodies to be dug up and bones used for various cultic practices. At first, all 3 teams said that no one in Africa did that kind of thing, and then, just as they were getting ready to leave the room, one of the translators admitted that normal people did not do it, but sorcerers, of course, did such things, and soon everyone else was admitting that it happened in their culture also. I did not expect to see changes in their translations, but later I looked at the verse, and 2 groups had added something about for the purpose of burying Joseph's bones there, and the national translator who first admitted that sorcerers did it had added a footnote, since their translation tends to be more literal. When one translator had the courage to speak up, it freed up the others to admit that someone might think they were taking the bones for some kind of sorcery. Due to the sudden death of a national translator and other difficulties, Language 2 has not yet completed the revision of their translation of Exodus. As a result, I can only present the statistics on 2 of the 3 languages that were in the cluster checking. Language 1 is the more meaning-based translation, and Language 3 is the more literal translation. I will first look at the types of notes that were made in each project, and then look at the impact of the notes on the actual translation. Finally, I will look at the quantities of other changes that were made in the projects. It has been my practice to use different note tags so that I can get a better feel for the areas with which the team is struggling. The major note tags are listed below in Figure 2. In cluster checking, the quantities are sometimes distorted because I often write one note that is sent to all 3 consultant note projects. In these kinds of notes, I am often evaluating the differences between the approaches chosen by each project and encouraging teams with the less acceptable translations to consider what was done in another project. Instead Stephen Payne's concept paper entitled Methods for Translation Consultants to Quantify Quality in a Consultant Check that was presented in December 2022, he suggested marking notes with 1. The suggestion improves their text and they make a change. 2. Their text is already fine as it is and no change is needed. 3. Their text is fine, but there was a back translation problem. Stephen was using this system to evaluate the quality of the translation. While that usage of the system is valid, as I began labeling the notes in these two projects, I found that I was looking at it in a different manner. If I had asked pertinent questions that resulted in changes, then my consulting efforts had an impact on the translation. If my questions resulted in no change, then my questioning had no impact on the translation. Many times I found that the comprehension questions that I asked did not result in changes, though there were exceptions. The questions that were back translation problems were mainly due to the fact that a gloss was missing or wrong in the interlinear. All of the projects in this cluster checking only provide the consultant with an interlinear and no real back translation. In addition to Stephen's labels, I added the category of not applicable. Due to the way that the consultant notes projects work in Paratext, I often accidentally placed notes in the wrong consultant notes project because I was evaluating 3 projects at the same time and failed to notice that I had not switched to the correct project. These not applicable notes were probably an irritant to the advisors or team members who had to deal with them. They definitely did not have a positive impact on the translation, but most of the time the other teams could recognize which language it was and tell me to move it to that language. Figure 5 contains a chart with a number of notes for each of the 2 projects that I was able to evaluate. In addition to changes that were the direct result of questions that I had asked, there were a large number of changes that were made sometime between when I had completed my notes in May 2022 and January 2023 when I did a final evaluation. Most of the changes were making key terms consistent, correcting punctuation, and making the translation clearer. These changes ranged in size from just adding a comma to almost totally revising the verse. See Figure 6 for the quantity of changes made in each project. Sometimes the changes that were made independently did not improve the text. For instance, in Language 3, the translation had been basically accurate in Exodus 26:12. In the first weeks after we had checked that verse, the team further specified the length of the selvage that was hanging over at the back of the tent, half of the width of a curtain. Unfortunately, the team was overly influenced by the size of the overhanging material on the sides and put in 50 centimeters, as seen in Exodus 26:13, instead of 1 meter, as it should have been. Thankfully, I saw this change while writing this paper and left a note for the team. In Language 1, I once asked about a missing gloss in Exodus 23:19, and they ended up correcting the entire verse. In the NRSV, the verse says, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." When the advisor was working with them, he wrote the following note. Translators said they didn't really understand how you could cook a goat in its mother's milk. The picture they were getting is that somehow its mother's milk functioned like the vessel of cooking. Strange. So they added a little to make this clear. Another caution. The word for milk and breast is the same in all of these languages here, including Swahili. So to make matters worse, after they translated it again, they actually translated it to where the goat must not be cooked together with its mother's breast. Needless to say, they then corrected it again, and now it is correct. I did not see the problem, but because I poked at the verse, the advisor heard things from a totally different perspective, and they were finally able to get the verse and its parallel in Exodus 34:26 corrected. These kinds of accidental poking of verses with unidentified problems occurred repeatedly during the session. I thank God that He heard our prayers and helped problem verses to be identified. Improvements in Paratext have made cluster checking much easier. In this oral presentation, I would like to specifically talk about the Compare Version tool and the Biblical Terms tool. In a normal checking session with one group, I always go back and listen to the oral back translation of a revised section and check the comprehension. In cluster checking, there is no time for that. In addition, I have found that some teams go off on tangents and are revising text here, there, and yonder while I am working with one specific team on a problem. Because of that, my practice is to check all changes made by each team in that book at the end of every day and then mark a point in the history of the project that I use for the start of the checking and compare version on the next day. If the new interlinear looks valid, or I know what they were changing and why, then I do not say anything further about it. If I see that the team has gotten confused and messed up their translation, I add another note in their consultant notes project so that the advisor and I know that the verse has an issue. Language 2 has honorifics. Because of that, any major adult needs to have a special marker before the name. Most of the time they had correctly entered the text, but in Exodus 33:1, we only found the error when I was doing some random training of the exegete after we had already checked the verse in the main session. Some would say that that kind of detail is not the responsibility of the consultant, but I believe that consultants should try to improve any aspect of the project that can be improved. So I added a note on Exodus 33:1 asking if they needed to add the honorific marker Ah. The same team had decided that they would have their word for land before every occurrence of Egypt when it was a reference to the country. The Biblical Terms tool flagged Exodus 19:1, and again it was after the verse had been checked in the session. I wrote a note for the team. The exegete had identified the issue when he was asked why the computer did not approve the verse. There are many positive and negative aspects of cluster checking. This paper has only touched on some of the issues. I do not believe that cluster checking is the best kind of checking, but there is no perfect kind of checking, and there is no perfect translation. Toward the end of the recent session, I was apologizing to one of the exegetes for the fact that the session was going so slowly because I was so detail-oriented. He responded and said that sometimes they needed a good kick in the backside in order to encourage them to be more attentive to details. Despite the difficulties, I have generally enjoyed the cluster checking. I have chosen to become involved with these sessions even though they are out of my comfort zone, and one of my motivations has been to encourage the exegetes to become consultants. They all speak Swahili well. Having Swahili-speaking consultants and running most of the sessions in Swahili would be a major way to improve the quality of the checking. Until then, I press onwards.